When we talk about antipsychotic medications, there's this really fundamental divide. They pretty much fall into two major camps. You've got the typicals and the atypicals. And picking between them, it's not simple at all. It's this critical trade-off between two completely different kinds of risks. So, how do they work? And what is that big choice that doctors and patients are up against? Let's dive in.
So what is the real difference here? It's not just about which one came first. It's all about how they interact with our brain chemistry. And this creates a really difficult choice. We're talking about weighing one serious set of potential side effects against a totally different but just as serious set.
All right, let's start at the beginning with the first generation, what we call the typical antipsychotics. Think of these as the original blueprint. They were an absolute game changer in treating psychosis, and their whole strategy is built around going after one specific target in the brain.
And that target is the dopamine D2 receptor. Now, to put it simply, conditions like psychosis are often linked to way too much dopamine signaling going on in certain brain pathways. So the entire game plan for these first-gen drugs is to basically put up a big roadblock right in front of that signal.
The way it works is actually pretty direct. You've got the problem, too much dopamine activity. So the drug comes in and it physically blocks the D2 receptors. It's kind of like sticking the wrong key in a lock so the real one can't get in. And the result? The dopamine signal gets turned way down, and that helps ease the symptoms of psychosis. It's a really powerful, direct approach.
Okay, but even inside this first generation, things get a little more complicated. See, the drugs are split into low-potency and high-potency types. And choosing between them brings up a whole new set of trade-offs, especially when it comes to side effects.
And here's where you can really see that dilemma in action. With the low-potency drugs, like chlorpromazine, you're going to get more sedation and what are called anticholinergic effects, stuff like dry mouth, blurred vision, but the risk of movement disorders is lower. Now let's flip over to the high-potency side. With a drug like haloperidol, you get much less sedation, but that risk of movement disorders, also known as extrapyramidal symptoms, or EPS, it just skyrockets. We're talking tremors, muscle stiffness, restlessness. It is a classic medical balancing act.
So let's look a little closer at these high-potency drugs. That risk of movement disorders is a huge deal, and it's considered to be at its absolute highest with haloperidol. But on a totally different note, they're also really powerful anti-vomiting drugs. There's another risk hiding here, though. They can actually lower the seizure threshold, which could potentially trigger a seizure in someone who already has epilepsy.
Of course, in medicine, there's almost always an exception to the rule, right? And in this case, it's a drug called thioridazine. Even though it's a high-potency drug, it's the one major outlier that does not have that anti-vomiting effect. That's a super important detail for doctors to keep in mind.
Now, even with all those differences in potency, there's one side effect that's a direct result of that core D2 blockade we talked about. By blocking dopamine receptors in the pituitary gland, these drugs can cause a big spike in a hormone called prolactin. This can lead to some really specific things like galactorrhea, that's unintended milk production, and amenorrhea, which means missed menstrual periods.
So all of those significant side effects from the first generation, especially the movement disorders, pushed researchers to develop a whole new class of drugs, the second generation, or the atypical antipsychotics. The goal here was to find a new way to get the job done, but with fewer of those really tough side effects.
And they found that new approach by changing the primary target. Instead of focusing so heavily on those dopamine D2 receptors, atypicals mainly go after serotonin receptors, specifically the 5-HT2A receptor. Now, some of them still affect D2 receptors a bit, but this fundamental shift in their main mechanism, well, that's what changes absolutely everything about their side effect profile.
And here it is, the main event. Because they don't rely so much on that heavy-handed dopamine blockade, atypical antipsychotics are far, far less likely to cause those really distressing movement disorders. This was the breakthrough everyone was hoping for, and it's the #1 reason these drugs are so widely used today.
But, and you knew there was a but coming. In solving one major problem, the atypicals introduced a completely new set of risks. This new challenge wasn't about the nervous system, it was metabolic.
Yeah, for a lot of patients, taking these atypical antipsychotics can lead to significant weight gain, hyperlipidemia, which is just a fancy way of saying high levels of cholesterol and fats in the blood, and sometimes even the development of brand new type 2 diabetes. This whole cluster of issues is often just called metabolic syndrome.
But hey, just like with the first generation, there are some really important exceptions to know about. Two of the atypical drugs, ziprasidone and aripiprazole, are big ones because they generally do not cause these metabolic side effects. And that makes them really, really important options to have in the toolkit.
So, when you just step back and look at the big picture, the choice between these two generations of drugs really starts to look like you're trading one set of problems for another. It's this fundamental dilemma right at the heart of modern psychiatric treatment.
It all really boils down to this. With the typicals, your main risk is neurologic, those really difficult and sometimes even permanent movement disorders. With the atypicals, you mostly get to avoid that risk, but you take on a whole new one that's metabolic, weight gain, high cholesterol, and potentially diabetes. This is the central trade-off.
And that leaves us with a huge question. When your main choice is between two very different but equally serious sets of risks, where do we even go from here? The challenge for medicine, moving forward, is to find a third generation, a new path that can give us all the benefits without this incredibly difficult trade-off.